Final presentation from the first day, I'm pleased to say, is from Stanley Robinson. Stan is, it has been argued, the most important living science fiction writer. He is someone who has been wrestling with issues of planetarity, particularly its geopolitics, long before the term was even articulated as such. In relationship to the terraforming program and initiative, must be said that his Terraforming Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, certainly set the gold standard for the fictionalization, sometimes not so fictional, depiction of this planetary geodesign initiative and the economic and political complexities involved. More recently, his novel Red Moon, which deals with the Chinese occupation of the moon and the geopolitical tensions that ensue from that, has been also illuminating and instructive. His next novel, Ministry of the Future, which Dan has generously made available to our researchers and to our program to read in advance of its publication, deals with the geoengineering. And I think in ways there's more of an expanded sense of geoengineering that we are addressing in the program, and particularly geoengineering as initiated from what is termed the global South, at a moment in which the legitimacy of the global North institutions to address or adjudicate or indeed prevent or govern such a project is uncertain, at least. Two other of the ideas that Stan's work overlaps with ours quite clearly is his interest in Edward O. Wilson's half-Earth hypothesis, which holds roughly that the total terrestrial footprint of humans should be concentrated into increasingly intensified urban settlements, such that as much as half of the Earth would be allowed to, in essence, rewild and remediate. And it's this kind of shifting of the logic of geography from one of discrete political settlements with individuated sovereignty into something more akin to a geography of zoning in relationship to particular kinds of functions and features that has played into, as you'll see in a lot of our work, the way in which the geographic is deployed. There was another term, comparative planetology, that was originally a term that geologists devised to discuss the differences between Earth and, say, Mars and Venus, once it became possible to sample the geology of those planets. Stan sort of raised this term, rehabilitated it, if you like, in an interview with one of our other terraforming faculty, Jeff Maynow, some years ago, and it became an idea that we worked with a lot in the previous iterations of the Strelka program, and indeed was a book, Introduction to Comparative Planetology. It was written by Lukasz Lekapczan, who was an alumni of our earlier program, and we had published this. So many points of alignment, suffice to say. Stan is also an alumni of UC San Diego, which is where we first met. And thank him very much for his participation in the program this year and the years to come. So with that, let me just introduce Stanley Robinson.
Hello, I am Stanley Robinson, and I'm here to talk to you today about Strelka Institute's Terraforming Design and Research Program, which I participated in earlier in this year, and I'm happy that to continue to be part of it because it's really an interesting program that has brought together a lot of ideas that we need to be thinking about now. So it's really a pleasure to be included, and I want to thank my colleague Benjamin Bratton and everybody else there for this opportunity. So really, it's terraforming, when you apply that word to the earth, is a little bit of an irony that can sound bad, because really the earth ought to already to be in a state that you don't need to terraform it. But it speaks to the necessity to deal with damage that we've done by accident to the earth, that if was allowed to continue in the way that we're going, would result in a mass extinction event that would hammer humanity's civilization. So we are caught in a very uncomfortable situation of attempting to invent a broad suite of technologies in time to avoid various catastrophes. And now that we're living in the pandemic of COVID-19, and there are other crises bearing down that collapse into each other and become one larger crisis, I think the necessity for the kind of thinking that's going on in this program has become more evident. So another word for this process has been geoengineering. And I believe that that word itself either needs to be replaced or rehabilitated, because at least in the United States, and I believe more generally, it has collected a bunch of connotations and understandings and critiques that means that nobody likes this word and therefore this concept of geoengineering. It's seen as bad for a variety of reasons that I'll list them very briefly, that it's a high-tech solution for problems that were created by high-tech, and therefore it's a kind of doubling down. It doesn't solve a lot of the problems that we have. It merely mitigates or dodges them, and perhaps they'll come back to bite us even harder later on. It seems to be a process that will always be heavily controlled by the state and by finance, and not by individuals and not by bottom up. It may create unintended side effects for anything that we try to do in a concerted, deliberate way to the planet at large, or even large swaths of it. It seems possible that there might be unintended side effects worse than what we try in the first place. And lastly, it somehow creates a kind of moral hazard that if we have possible solutions to our problems in mind that don't reach the root causes, that we will then go ahead and keep doing the bad things, basically burning a lot of carbon, with the idea that we'll be able to fix it later on by way of these various geoengineering ideas. And this in economics and in philosophy is sometimes called the moral hazard of thinking you can get out of something by doing something else. And then I guess the last objection would be simply that the whole idea of geoengineering is a kind of fantasy, that we don't have the power to do anything at planetary scale in a deliberate, positive way, so that these are fantasy notions that allow us to not think the hard thoughts or do the hard things. So, well, this is fairly impressive and you might say powerful critique, but in the end of the day, which is to say right now, we are still burning carbon heavily, even with the COVID-19 pandemic and the shutdown of our economy around the world. We are still burning about 80% as much. I mean, we've heard all kinds of different figures, but let's just say we're burning a fairly significant proportion of what we were burning before, despite a radical change in how everybody's been living in the developed world in terms of cutting down their energy consumption. At least it looked so, but we all live on electricity. We all do rely on some transport in the infrastructure, even if we ourselves are sheltering in place. The food is coming to us. And so what we've seen is we're still burning a lot of carbon, and we are headed for a moment in planetary history when the rise in average global temperatures, the heat rising on the planet, is going to reach critical temperatures in certain places around the globe, what is now getting better and better known as wet bulb temperature, which is a combination of heat and humidity that will kill people. And there is no recourse except possibly air conditioning but air conditioning relies on electricity, and air conditioning millions of people, particularly if they're trying to stay socially distanced. But even if people were willing to jam in like sardines in a can, air conditioning millions of people for, say, 2 weeks to a month at a time is impractical. So we are headed to such a dangerous moment in human history, not to mention the mass extinction, that the argument against geoengineering that has to do with the moral hazard, like if we were to think we had these things in place, we might keep doing the bad things. I believe that argument has been completely demolished by reality itself. We are in an all hands on deck moment where we are very likely in the next couple of decades going to have to do everything we possibly can think to do to lower the global average temperatures, which means to decarbonize, which means geoengineering in some larger definition of the term. And this means that no matter what your political, moral objections to geoengineering might be, the various powerful critiques, in the all hands on deck scenario, we may be trying everything. Therefore, we need to do the thinking in now. We need to start imagining that the necessity for action is going to drive actions, and some of them will be better in terms of more effective and safer, and some of them will be worse. And these distinctions need to be made. And this is the work that the Strelka Institute has been engaged on in these last couple of years. And there aren't that very many places on Earth that are doing it yet. And yet the necessity for this very kind of thought is now crashing on down us in a way that we're not going to be able to avoid. So I think that it's possible to broaden the definition of geoengineering to say that it is all and every deliberate planetary mass action that would alter the human biosphere relationship. And what we need is a new definition, because really geoengineering had shrunk down in its definition to solar radiation management, of tossing some kind of dust or sulfur dioxide, some particulates up into the atmosphere that would imitate the Pinatubo explosion and then bounce some sunlight away from Earth, reduce temperatures without touching the root causes as an emergency measure. That is still going to be on the table for sure. But there are bigger, a larger definition would bring in all kinds of things that aren't usually thought of as geoengineering and yet would be good. The tech innovations, sure, solar radiation management is something that probably the Paris Agreement apparatus ought to be talking about right now. That idea of putting iron dust into the ocean, causing an algal bloom that would then die and sink to the bottom, naturally everybody is frightened at the idea of disturbing a biological system as complex and important as the ocean. And yet, it is also a very limited kind of experiment that when run, no matter how much damage it might do locally, it would not be a run-on effect that would be systemic and global. It might be testable, but there also might be better ways to draw down carbon. So drawing down carbon out of the atmosphere can have high-tech solutions such as direct air capture by machinery, by industrial infrastructure that simply sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere and then either puts that CO2 to use or buries it in the ground in some kind of long-term storage. And really, we're in such an emergency that the long-term can be defined rather loosely because we may need it even if it's escaping 5,000 years from now. The time horizon is shrinking on us because of the level of danger involved. Then also changed human behaviors in a systemic way. Well, that's software rather than hardware, but it's still technology. I've been making this argument for a long time. Law is a technology, a software. Justice is a technology, and indeed language is a technology itself. So you've got to get away from defining technology as simply machinery, and especially new machinery, and get back to the systems idea that it really means coordinated human action is also a kind of a technology. And in that case, cultural shifts that are broad and um, broad-based and agreed upon by people to do voluntarily are going to be important and can be defined as a kind of geoengineering in and of themselves. So habits of consumption, which maybe speaks to questions of religion, of thinking of the earth as Gaia, of treating it as a space that we have to steward because we are the responsible agents. And now we know, because of the pandemic, that people, when they're scared for their lives, they'll change their consumption habits on a dime. And if you're scared for your grandchildren's lives, maybe you also will change your behaviors. I believe fear of imminent death is probably the best spur in our butts, but we are thinking creatures and have a sense of the future. So a fear for your grandchildren might matter. Women's rights on this planet, there are huge differentials in how much power women have over their own lives. And it is a demonstrable fact made by demographers and political scientists that the more power women have over their own lives, the less quickly the population grows. And indeed, the population begins to decrease in ways that are voluntary and useful rather than catastrophic and forced. So it is I hope, a, a useful mind stretcher to think of women's rights as a geoengineering methodology of huge power, but it needs to be thought of that way because a gradually lessening human population would be good for our relationship to the planet, while never wanting to be anti-humanist, while wanting always to say that the number of humans that's going to appear on the planet in the 21st century can all be taken care of by the human community adequately. Nobody gets to be labeled as unnecessary or redundant. Everybody has equal rights to being human on this planet, and the planet can support us all if we were to organize correctly. So it's a really important point to make there. But then you also have to say that if there were 4 billion people or 5 billion people rather than 8, the stresses on the planet would be lessened. And so it has to be brought up as a long-term matter of voluntary human behaviors, and that the fact that two goods result from one action, which is to say the expansion of women's rights planet-wide, is simply a good thing that needs to be pointed out. Then lastly, all of this is going to come down to political economy, all the good things that we do in carbon reduction, and really the Stelco program and its 9 project points and the things that you can read about around the world in regenerative agriculture and carbon drawdown by way of reforestation and peat bogs and swamps and biochar, kelp beds, and the list goes on of the ways that which we can draw carbon down. They are going to have to be paid for, and we are going to have to re-engineer our political economy worldwide so that it isn't neoliberal late capitalism with its extraction, its inequality, its terribly bad pricing, its ignoring of the future, its reality as a Ponzi scheme that we all live in together, ripping off the generations to come. The change, which I'm just going to call post-capitalism, has to come sooner the better. It needs to be stepwise. It needs to be changing laws. It needs to be voluntary and legal. There is no possible revolutionary mechanism that doesn't create more chaos and disorder than it brings. So I'm advocating the most rapid possible reforms to a post-capitalist economy. And what that would mean is that we actually pay ourselves in the form of some kind of carbon coin for the decarbonizing actually makes people a living. So it has to be paid for outside the profit motive. So that's a government intervention of sorts, because governments really create economies. And then also full employment, a job guarantee. There's work and more for everybody on the planet. And if everybody had a job guarantee from the government and governments became the employers of last resort, then, and also set a living wage for their employees, this would radically change the way that we're working now into something more equitable and more communalist, something that where we're all in it together in a kind of solidarity to solve the civilizational emergency that we're now in. And so these are legal instruments, these are laws. And so legislation becomes important, politics becomes important. It's a little bit sad to have to say that, but unfortunately, it's inescapable. There is no techno fix that within this economy would get us out of the problems that we're in. So geoengineering is a problem in political economy. And that's, I think, the main point that I need to make. To kind of draw to a close, having made such a utopian statement as that, and a call for really systemic changes that are quite profound because they go against the order of the world that we're in right now, and that order is massively in place. Laws, police, army, and governments that are to a certain extent bought by the oligarchy of the rich and privileged on this planet, who, for whatever reason, haven't gotten it, that it's all or nobody, that you can't buy your way out of this global coming crisis. Why that isn't more evident is surprising to me. But I will say that just as people say power corrupts, a little power corrupts a little, and money is a form of power. So if you've got a lot of money, the temptation to be corrupted by it and think for in some short-sighted way that corruption isn't just a matter of cheating, because all of this is quite legal. Corruption is a matter of your thought processes being distorted to the point where you can think that a kind of narcissism of if I'm okay and my immediate kin are okay, that doesn't matter about the rest. But in this situation coming down on us, nobody can be okay. So it's a kind of all or nothing situation. It's an all hands on deck situation. And that means that the changes that the younger generations are facing are quite striking and almost staggering. On the other hand, I don't think there's any choice. So the reforms are going to have to deal with an incredibly powerful, entrenched set of interests that are already there in place. But that's leading us to disaster. So there's going to have to be geoengineering. And a lot of people who like the current order will seize that word, seize that concept, thinking we'll just perform one more silver bullet trick and we'll be able to keep on living the way that we live. That's not quite true, and is one of the major redefinitions of geoengineering. And I can see this already happening in the Strelka Institute's work. Its focus on economy, its focus on decarbonization. It's spreading a very broad net of possibilities and redefining it. And that's really the necessary work, I think, that's gone on here. And the rest of this conference, this virtual conference with its presentation, the work of this particular collective is really important and stimulative. It's, I would say, a privilege to be included. And I would like to end with thanks to everybody there. And I'm going to be, I have only seen the abstracts of some presentations. I'm going to be watching this whole thing like everybody else from this point on with a great deal of pleasure and interest. And you know, as a science fiction writer, I will also be thinking, these are good stories because they're positive, they're utopian, they're achievable and practical, and they're pointed right at the major issue of our time. So thank you and good luck. And I am really looking forward to the rest of Strelka's program here. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Stan, for your remarks. Always extremely thought-provoking, and as usual was again today. Thanks to our audience for joining us for the presentation of the work that we've done over the past 5 months. We have set a whole nother day of work tomorrow. We're about halfway through the whole. To us, this still really feels like kind of just a summary of the conversations that we've been part of and developed over the last 5 months, and so are grateful for the opportunity to welcome you into the discourse. Would also invite you again to make use of the links below. If you'd like, download a copy of the Little Black Book and some of the other material we have that will allow you to wade in a little bit deeper into the terraforming initiative. So tomorrow we will have 2 more keynotes for UC Paracon and Helen Hester. We'll begin with UC's keynote, and then the design projects Black, Almanac, and DeLaco. We hear from one of our remote researchers, Ji Chen, then Helen Hester's keynote. Project Veha, a remote researcher, Jamie Boyd, and then we will conclude with the project Cassandra. Until then, thanks very much, and we will see you tomorrow.